The Strait of Hormuz looks almost too small to explain the fear around it. A narrow blue passage crowded with tankers between the Gulf and the open ocean. But pull the map back and another shape appears. Long lines crossing desert, linking oil fields, storage hubs, ports that do not all point through the same choke point. That is the part of the story that rarely gets the dramatic headline. The world keeps asking whether Hormuz can be blocked. The quieter question is whether it can be bypassed just enough to weaken the leverage that comes from threatening it. You may have seen this framed as a $100 billion oil escape plan, but the sharper question is not whether a giant bypass looks convincing on a graphic. It is whether real routes with real limits can change the balance of power in a crisis. So the rule here is simple. Public infrastructure is treated as fact. Future expansions, headline price tags, and hidden motives are treated carefully, because if Hormuz is so powerful, the mystery is not why countries want alternatives. The mystery is why they have spent decades building routes that only partially solve the problem. To understand the pipeline race, we first have to understand why Hormuz became so powerful in the first place. On a simple map, the Strait of Hormuz is the narrow exit from the Gulf into the Gulf of Oman, then into the wider ocean. To the north is Iran. To the south are Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Behind it sit major energy exporters, storage hubs, ports, and tanker routes. In front of it is the sea road to global customers. That is the basic geography. Oil and gas move from inland fields to coastal terminals. Tankers collect those cargoes. Then, for many Gulf exports, the ship has to pass through this same maritime corridor before it can reach open water. This is what makes Hormuz a choke point. Not because it is the only narrow waterway on Earth, not because every barrel in the region moves through it, but because so many contracts, ships, security calculations, and government decisions converge in one visible place. That is also why every shipping crisis pulls attention back to the same question: what happens if the route becomes dangerous, restricted, or politically uncertain? Headlines often go straight to military scenarios because warships are easy to picture and conflict is easy to dramatize. But beneath that visible drama is a quieter infrastructure question. If a country depends on a sea lane, how does it reduce that dependence before a crisis begins? This is where the online conversation often splits into two familiar angles. One asks how Gulf exporters might bypass Hormuz, sometimes through the language of a huge oil escape plan. The other asks why a powerful military, especially the United States, cannot simply seize, secure, or control the strait. Both questions are understandable, both are dramatic, but both can miss the harder story underneath. Controlling a sea lane is not the same as making it risk-free. A tanker owner still thinks about safety. An insurer still thinks about uncertainty. A government still thinks about escalation. A buyer still thinks about whether cargo will arrive on schedule. It is a fact that Hormuz is geopolitically sensitive. It is speculation to predict exactly how any future crisis would unfold. So this is not a forecast of war, and it is not a claim that any government is preparing to close the strait. It is a story about resilience. Pipelines, storage, terminals, and alternate ports can reduce exposure to one dangerous corridor, but they cannot erase geography. They can make Hormuz less powerful. They cannot make it powerless. And the surprising part is that the bypass story did not begin with one megaproject. It began with a basic realization. The safest tanker in a Hormuz crisis may be the one that never enters the strait at all. That is the simple engineering idea behind the desert detour. Instead of loading crude only at terminals inside the Gulf, a country can push oil through steel arteries across land, then load it at a coast outside the choke point. On a map, the logic looks almost disarmingly simple. The narrow blue exit at Hormuz stops being the only arrow. New arrows appear across the desert. Some point west toward the Red Sea, others point east toward the Gulf of Oman, beyond the most sensitive part of the strait. This is why pipelines matter in a way that warship headlines often miss. A tanker has to obey the geography of the sea. A pipeline can rewrite part of the route before the tanker ever appears. Saudi Arabia is the clearest public example of the Western option. It has long maintained east-west pipeline infrastructure that can move crude from the Gulf side of the kingdom toward export facilities on the Red Sea. The point is not that this makes Saudi Arabia immune to a Hormuz crisis. It does not. The point is that it gives the country another door. If one exit becomes risky, some oil can move toward a different coastline through infrastructure that was built, maintained, and defended over many years. The United Arab Emirates shows a different version of the same idea. Publicly known pipeline routes have moved crude from inland production areas toward Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman side. Fujairah matters because it sits outside the inner Gulf route that forces tankers through Hormuz. Again, this is not a magic portal. It still depends on storage, terminals, shipping access, and regional security, but visually it changes the map. Abu Dhabi crude does not have to be imagined only as a tanker waiting inside the Gulf. Part of the story can be imagined as a line running overland to a port already closer to open water. This is where the phrase bypass Hormuz becomes too simple. A pipeline is not just a line on a graphic, it has limits. It can only move what it was designed to move. Capacity matters, the type of crude matters, pumping stations matter, maintenance schedules matter, storage tanks at the far end matter, export terminals matter. Even the ability to blend, load, insure, and schedule cargoes matters. A country may have a bypass route, but that does not mean every barrel can instantly switch direction during a crisis. It also does not mean every Gulf exporter has equal access to the same escape route. Geography helps some states more than others. Saudi Arabia has its Red Sea frontage. The Emirates has Fujairah. Other producers face different constraints, different politics, and different levels of dependence on the same narrow sea lane. So the real race is not a race to erase Hormuz, it is a race to build partial shields. Each route reduces exposure by a degree. Each storage site adds flexibility. Each terminal outside the most vulnerable corridor gives decision-makers one more option when markets are nervous and shipping companies are cautious. That is why the desert detour is so powerful as an idea and so limited as a solution. From above, the pipeline looks clean and decisive. Underground, it becomes a system of valves, pumps, contracts, inspections, security perimeters, and political assumptions. The more impressive the line looks on a map, the more the real constraints matter beneath the sand. And there is one final twist. A pipeline that bypasses the strait creates a new problem. It turns a maritime choke point into a land-based target. This is where the cost of escaping Hormuz becomes more complicated than the headline. The real race may not be about who builds the biggest pipe. It may be about who can keep exporting when everyone else is forced to wait. That is why the most dramatic way to describe this story, the $100 billion oil escape plan, can also be the most misleading. A giant number makes the bypass race sound like a single switch waiting to be flipped. Spend enough money, draw a new line across the desert, and the Strait of Hormuz loses its grip. But infrastructure does not work like that. A pipeline is a chain of decisions, permissions, machines, storage sites, ports, contracts, guards, and maintenance crews. Each link has to function under ordinary conditions. Then it has to keep functioning when the reason for building the system finally arrives, a crisis. Start with the route. A long-distance pipeline needs rights-of-way across land that may be remote, politically sensitive, environmentally difficult, or already crowded with other infrastructure. Then it needs pumping stations because crude oil does not simply glide across hundreds of kilometers by itself. It needs power. It needs monitoring. It needs repairs. It needs valves, control rooms, and crews who can reach the line when something goes wrong. At the far end, the problem changes shape. Moving oil away from Hormuz is only useful if it can be loaded somewhere else. That means storage tanks, export terminals, berths, inspection systems, and the constant choreography of ships arriving, waiting, filling, and leaving. A bypass route can fail not because the pipe is too small, but because the terminal at the other end cannot handle the stress of a sudden surge. Then there is security. The whole point of a bypass pipeline is to reduce exposure to a maritime choke point. But the moment oil moves across land, the risk does not disappear. It relocates. A sea lane can be threatened by naval tension, mines, missiles, drones, insurance fears, or port closures. A land route can be threatened by sabotage, technical failure, political disputes, or attacks on pumping stations and terminals. One vulnerability is traded for another. This is where the economics become less glamorous but more important. A pipeline that is rarely used at full capacity can look wasteful in peacetime. It ties up capital, demands upkeep, and may require export facilities that are oversized for normal conditions. Yet in a crisis, that same spare capacity can become strategic. It can give a government more options. It can reassure buyers. It can reduce panic, even if it cannot replace every tanker that would normally pass through Hormuz. That partial effect matters. A bypass route does not have to make Hormuz irrelevant to change bargaining power. It only has to make dependence less absolute. If a country can keep some exports moving while others are delayed, it has more room to maneuver. If markets believe there are credible alternatives, even limited ones, the psychology of a crisis may change. But this is also where caution is necessary. Some proposed corridors, expansions, or regional pipeline ideas may be speculative, disputed, delayed, or commercially unattractive. Some may exist mostly as planning concepts. Some may make sense on a map but struggle against finance, politics, terrain, or demand. The honest version is exploratory, not triumphant. Interest around shipping crises is pulling people toward infrastructure explanations, but the evidence around any single secret master plan is thinner than the broader interest in choke points and supply chains. So this is not a claim that one verified megaproject is about to remake global oil overnight. What viewers are really watching is not just an oil story. It is a supply chain resilience story. The question is not whether the Gulf can escape geography completely. It is whether expensive, imperfect, hard-to-defend infrastructure can buy enough redundancy to make the most famous choke point on Earth slightly less decisive. And that brings us to the other popular question. Why can't a powerful navy simply make Hormuz safe? There is a tempting answer to every Hormuz panic: send more warships. If the strait is the problem, then control the strait. If tankers are afraid, put power around them. But a choke point is not just a line on the water, it is a decision system. Every ship owner, insurer, port operator, buyer, seller, government, and crew has to decide whether the risk is acceptable today. Military presence can change those calculations. It can deter threats. It can reassure partners. But it cannot turn a nervous trade route into an ordinary highway by announcement alone. This is the part that often gets lost in dramatic maps. A full physical closure is only one version of disruption. There are also smaller fears that can ripple outward. A rumor can slow decisions, a warning can change routing, a rise in perceived danger can affect insurance, a port can become cautious, a tanker company can wait for clarity, markets can react before every fact is known. None of that requires certainty about what will happen next. It only requires enough uncertainty to make people hesitate. That is why force cannot fully solve geography. Even if a powerful navy is present, the strait remains narrow, crowded, visible, and politically charged. It remains a place where ordinary commercial traffic moves through an extraordinary strategic environment. The issue is not only whether ships can pass, it is whether the entire system around those ships believes they can pass safely, predictably, and at a cost that still makes sense. Here, the distinction between fact and theory matters. It is a fact that Hormuz is geopolitically sensitive. It is a fact that governments and energy markets pay close attention when tensions rise around it. But it is speculation to claim exactly how a future crisis would unfold, how long disruption would last, how every insurer, port, or trading desk would respond. The point is not to predict a war, it is to understand why infrastructure becomes attractive when military certainty is impossible. A land route does something warships cannot do. It removes part of the export flow from the daily psychology of the sea lane. It gives planners another path, another terminal, another set of choices. During a crisis, even partial redundancy can matter because it may reduce the pressure to solve every problem in the strait at once. But the pipeline solution has its own weakness. A route across land must be protected. It depends on pumping stations, storage, maintenance crews, political stability, and export terminals. It can avoid a maritime choke point, but it does not escape risk altogether. It simply changes the shape of the risk. This is also why the Hormuz story fits the wider moment online. Viewers are drawn to big systems stories, whether the subject is artificial intelligence, biotechnology, supply chains, or geopolitics. But those other breakout topics are not evidence of a hidden Hormuz master plan. They only show that audiences are paying attention to the machinery underneath headlines. In Hormuz, that machinery is infrastructure, not a magic shield, not a guaranteed escape. a set of imperfect routes built because confidence at sea can never be taken for granted. And this is where the story becomes stranger. The more countries try to escape Hormuz, the more valuable the remaining open sea lane may still become. Because bypass routes do not make the strait irrelevant, they change what the strait represents. If there are no alternatives, the choke point is everything. If there are partial alternatives, the choke point becomes something more complex. It is still a vital route, but now it sits inside a wider system of pipelines, storage hubs, alternate ports, naval patrols, market expectations, and political signals. That makes the future less simple, not more simple. A pipeline to the Red Sea can reduce one kind of exposure. A route to Fujairah can reduce another. Storage can buy time. Terminals can create flexibility. But every added route becomes another asset to defend, maintain, and politically justify. This is the hidden logic of redundancy. It makes a system harder to break completely, but it also makes the system larger, more expensive, and more complicated. That is the strange ending to the Hormuz story. The most important change may not look dramatic from the sea. It may look like a line across the desert, a pumping station in the heat, a storage tank near a port, a terminal built just far enough away from the narrow waterway to matter. The race to bypass Hormuz is real, as a strategic pattern, but it is not a magic trick. It is not one switch that can be pulled to make the strait irrelevant. It is built slowly, project by project, around a basic fear: too much of the global energy system has to pass through one small piece of water. Geography gives Hormuz its power. It sits where Gulf energy meets the open ocean. That fact cannot be negotiated away. Pipelines answer that power only partially. They create alternatives, but they also create limits. They need capacity, they need maintenance, they need secure routes, reliable terminals, political cooperation, and confidence that they will still function under pressure. And even when they work, they do not move every barrel, solve every bottleneck, or remove every risk. Then comes the third piece: crisis politics. A pipeline that looks modest in calm conditions can become extremely valuable in a moment of fear. It can give a government more options. It can help a company keep part of its exports moving. It can reduce dependence on daily tanker traffic through one crowded corridor. But its real value depends on what kind of crisis unfolds, how markets react, how insurers judge risk, and how governments behave. Those parts are uncertain. No responsible explanation should pretend otherwise. So the thumbnail image is not a simple before and after. A desert pipeline on one side, a narrow sea lane on the other. One is not safety and the other danger. They are two different kinds of vulnerability. The sea lane can be watched, threatened, escorted, delayed, or feared. The pipeline can be protected, expanded, damaged, repaired, or constrained. The question is not which one eliminates risk. The question is how many routes exist when risk arrives. That may be why this story matters now. Shipping crisis headlines pull attention toward the water. Warships, tankers, and choke points are easy to picture, but underneath that visible drama is a quieter supply chain story about resilience. The future of Gulf energy security may be shaped less by one spectacular closure, more by years of investment in optional routes that never fully replace Hormuz, but make it harder for any one crisis to hold everything hostage. The next story could follow the Red Sea export corridors, the rise of Fujairah as an energy hub, the longer history of oil choke points that shaped the modern economy. Hormuz may never lose its power completely, but the race to make it less powerful has already begun.